Everything you think you know about the most famous psychology experiment in history is wrong. For 50 years, college textbooks, true crime documentaries, and 100 YouTube videos have told you the same story. 24 ordinary young men, a fake prison in a basement. Some became guards, some became prisoners, and within 6 days the guards turned into monsters. Not because they were bad people, but because the situation made them that way. It became the explanation for Nazi Germany, for Abu Ghraib, for every atrocity committed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and it might be one of the most successful science frauds of the 20th century. Stick with me, because by the end of this video you'll understand not just what really happened in that basement, but why a flawed study became one of the most repeated stories in psychology, and what that says about all of us. Let's start at the beginning, with the story you already know. It's August 1971. Philip Zimbardo, a young psychology professor at Stanford University, places a newspaper ad asking for male college students to take part in a study on prison life. $70 a day, 2 weeks of work. Over 70 men respond. Zimbardo and his team screen out anyone with a history of psychological problems, crime, or drug use. They want a baseline group of healthy, ordinary young men. 24 selected. A coin flip decides who becomes a prisoner and who becomes a guard. The basement of Stanford's psychology building is converted into a makeshift jail, with bars on the doors and a closet repurposed as a solitary confinement cell they call the Hole. Zimbardo doesn't just design the study, he appoints himself the prison superintendent, a role he will later admit changed how he behaved for the entire experiment. The stage is set for what Zimbardo would call a demonstration of how situations, not personalities, turn good people cruel. On a Sunday morning, real Palo Alto police officers show up at the homes of the 9 young men assigned to be prisoners. Without warning, they're arrested, searched, handcuffed, and driven to the station, fingerprinted like real criminals before being blindfolded and taken to the basement prison. There, they're stripped naked, sprayed with delousing powder, and given numbered smocks to wear instead of clothes. No names, just numbers. From now on, prisoner 8612 isn't a person. He's a number on a list. This isn't an accident. It's deliberate dehumanization, designed to strip away identity in the same way real prison intake procedures do. The guards, meanwhile, are given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses so prisoners can't see their eyes, and wooden batons. They're told only one thing: maintain law and order in the prison by whatever means they see fit, except physical violence. What happens next would become a famous case study in how fast that line gets crossed. The first day is calm, almost playful. The guards aren't sure what to do with their new authority, but by day 2 something shifts. The prisoners, irritated by the conditions, barricade themselves in their cells and rip off their numbered smocks in protest. The guards retaliate, using fire extinguishers to blast the prisoners back, stripping the ringleaders naked and putting the instigator in solitary confinement. From here, the guards start inventing their own forms of control. Surprise headcounts in the middle of the night, push-ups as punishment, sometimes with a guard's boot on a prisoner's back. Prisoners are forced to clean toilets with their bare hands. Privileges like meals and bathroom visits become tools of psychological manipulation, granted or denied based on a guard's mood. By day 3, one guard begins calling himself John Wayne, adopting a southern accent and a swagger, becoming the cruelest figure in the experiment. The story that gets told for the next 50 years is that nobody forced him to do this. The situation did. By day 2, prisoner number 8612 starts showing signs of severe psychological distress, uncontrollable crying, disorganized thinking, rage. According to the official record, the researchers offer to make him a snitch in exchange for better treatment. He refuses, and that night he completely breaks down. He's released from the study. 3 more prisoners follow with similar breakdowns over the next few days. The remaining prisoners settle into a kind of learned helplessness. They stop resisting. They follow orders. They start referring to the worst guards by their assigned roles rather than their names, as if John Wayne really had replaced the college student underneath. The study was planned to run for 2 weeks. It shut down on day 6. Zimbardo says he ended it after his girlfriend, a psychologist named Christina Maslach, visited the basement, was horrified by what she saw, and confronted him, asking what he had done to those boys. For decades, this is presented as the moment a brilliant researcher had a moral awakening. It becomes the ending of the story everyone tells. For the next 5 decades, the Stanford Prison Experiment becomes one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology. It's taught in nearly every introductory psychology class on Earth. It's used to explain the My Lai massacre, the Holocaust, and most famously, the abuse of prisoners by American soldiers at Abu Ghraib in 2003, where commentators directly compared the guards' behavior to Zimbardo's findings. The conclusion drawn from the study is simple, terrifying, and strangely comforting all at once. Ordinary people aren't naturally cruel. They're shaped by the roles and situations they're placed in. Give a normal person a uniform, unchecked power, and a dehumanized target, and brutality follows almost automatically. It's a story that lets us off the hook individually while indicting the systems around us. It's clean. It's dramatic. It has a villain, a victim, and a moral. And that, it turns out, might be exactly the problem. Because a story this clean rarely survives contact with the full historical record. Here's where the story everyone knows starts to fall apart. For decades, isolated critics raised concerns about the experiment's methodology. Small objections, easy to dismiss. Then, in 2018, a French researcher named Thibault Le Texier got access to archival material that previous critics hadn't seen. Original audio recordings, unpublished transcripts, interviews with the actual participants, both guards and prisoners, decades after the fact. What he found wasn't a story about ordinary people spontaneously turning cruel because of an unstructured situation. It was a story about a research team actively shaping the outcome they wanted, then telling the public a different version of events. The famous narrative, that nobody told the guards to be brutal, that it just happened on its own, turned out to be, according to Le Texier's findings, simply untrue. And once you pull that thread, the entire foundation of one of psychology's most influential studies starts to unravel. According to the recordings Le Texier uncovered, before the study even began, Zimbardo gathered the guards for an orientation meeting. He didn't tell them to passively maintain order and see what happened naturally. Reports describe him explaining the experiment's purpose in language that pointed directly at the result he wanted, telling the men they were studying things like loss of identity and feelings of powerlessness, essentially handing them the blueprint for the behavior the study would later discover. One of the research team members, a man named David Jaffe, played the role of warden inside the simulated prison. On the recordings, Jaffe is heard directly instructing a guard who wasn't being aggressive enough, telling him he needed to be a tougher guard, that he was being too soft, and pushing him to act more like the warden's idea of what a hardened, authoritarian guard should be. This wasn't subtle situational pressure slowly emerging on its own. This was direct coaching toward a predetermined outcome, recorded on tape, decades before anyone outside Stanford ever heard it. The coaching wasn't the only problem. Interviews conducted decades later revealed that the most notorious guard, the one nicknamed John Wayne, wasn't a random ordinary person discovering a hidden capacity for cruelty. In later interviews, he described consciously performing a character, modeling his behavior on a cruel warden from the 1967 film Cool Hand Luke, essentially auditioning for what he believed the researchers wanted to see. And the famous breakdown of prisoner 8612. In interviews years afterward, he admitted it wasn't quite the spontaneous psychological collapse the official story described. He said he faked elements of it because he realized he couldn't simply leave the study, and a breakdown seemed like his only way out. None of this was random suffering emerging from an unstructured situation. It was performance, shaped by what participants believed the researchers wanted, layered on top of direct instructions from the research team itself. The natural experiment in human nature was, by these accounts, closer to an unscripted reality show with a director standing just off camera. To be fair, this isn't a settled, one-sided story either. Zimbardo strongly disputed Letexier's conclusions, calling the critique largely ad hominem and arguing it ignored evidence supporting his original findings. He maintained, until his death in 2024, that the core lesson, that situational and systemic forces can push ordinary people toward harmful behavior, sometimes without their full awareness, still holds, regardless of how messy the original 1971 study was. A 2024 National Geographic documentary revisited the case with new interviews from the original participants, and largely supported Letexier's account of coaching and performance, while still wrestling with what, if anything, the experiment actually proves. So where does that leave us? Probably here the Stanford Prison Experiment is not solid evidence that ordinary situations alone turn people cruel, but it might be excellent evidence of something else entirely: how easily people conform to what authority figures expect of them, especially when those expectations are made explicit. That's a real and well-supported finding. It's just not the finding the study became famous for. So why did a study this flawed become one of the most repeated stories in the history of psychology? Partly because it's a great story. It has a clear hypothesis, a dramatic turning point, and a moral that flatters our intuitions about human nature, that we are products of our environment, capable of darkness under the wrong conditions. Partly because it was retold for decades, before anyone had access to the archives that exposed the coaching. And partly because once a story becomes the explanation for things like Abu Ghraib, it gains a kind of institutional momentum. Textbooks cite other textbooks. Documentaries cite the textbooks. Nobody goes back to the original tapes. This isn't really a story about one experiment from 1971. It's a story about how a compelling narrative can outrun the evidence behind it for 50 years, simply because nobody had the access or the incentive to check. That should make you a little more skeptical the next time a psychology fact sounds too perfectly dramatic to be true. Often the real story is messier, less cinematic, and far more interesting than the legend. The Stanford Prison Experiment isn't unique. It's one of dozens of famous psychological studies that got simplified, dramatized, and passed down until the legend replaced the evidence. And that's exactly why this archive exists. 142 real case studies examined for what the evidence actually shows, not just what makes the best textbook anecdote. If today's video changed how you think about one famous study, imagine what's waiting in the other 141. Some of them are just as misunderstood as this one. Some are even stranger than the official story suggests. Subscribe and click the case study on your screen right now to keep going, because the most disturbing thing about psychology often isn't the experiment itself. It's how long a good story can survive without anyone checking if it's actually true. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case file.